everybody, good to see you again. My name is Wes Moore, and welcome to session 2 of our 5-part economic justice series. I am absolutely thrilled to be here as a Science Institute fellow and also as the CEO of Robinhood, which is one of the largest poverty fighting organizations in the country. And as part of this, as part of being a Science Institute fellow, we really had to think about what were the different topics that we really wanted to revolve around. And it was really about how do we address this issue of poverty? How do we address this issue that has sat with our society since its inception? This idea that we have had an underclass, oftentimes an incredibly predictable underclass, that we have yet to come up with real, calcified, and truly hard ways of being able to address something that is a larger ill within our structures. When people say that one of the things we wanted to do and highlight with this seminar is that when people say, well, that poverty is a choice, the reality is poverty is a choice, but it's not a choice for the people who are living in it. It's not a choice for people who are feeling the weight and feeling the constraints of poverty every single day. Poverty is a choice, but really it's society's choice. It's our choice. It hovers and it revolves around this idea of asking how much pain we are willing to tolerate in those around us. And so the real fulcrum for this conversation tonight, the first time we talked about these elements of truth and reconciliation and also restorative justice. But this evening's topic is going to revolve around the role of government in achieving economic justice, where every level of government must acknowledge and also rectify the legacy of biased public policies and also continue to bolster a way of addressing this larger socioeconomic divide that we have. It is through policy reform and program development that local and state and federal leaders are going to be able to address these gaps, these wealth gaps, these income gaps, these hope gaps that are existing and actually creating real full barriers for people to find ways of their opportunity to meet their ambition. And so today's discussion will really offer insight and information on a variety of policies which support sustainable economic opportunities for everyone. And I could not be more excited and happier to have two people who are not just two of the most important leaders in our country when it comes to engaging in this debate, but also two people that I'm very proud to call personal friends, and that is Mayor Michael Tubbs and also Michael Blake. But before I get to them and introduce them, I just want to set the stage a little bit for people to understand what exactly it is that we're talking about. Because issues of economic inequality cannot be solved through philanthropy or business alone. The reason that we have the divides that we have is not because philanthropy hasn't done its job or business hasn't done its job or NGOs haven't done their jobs. It is oftentimes because we have policies that are both putting people and keeping people in poverty. It's because more often than not, economic disparities can be directly traced to a policy decision or a piece of legislation. And we don't have to just take a look at Jim Crow era policies as one perfect example. When people talk about the wealth divide, the a little over 10-to-1 racial wealth gap that exists within the United States, you can just look at policies that were put in place that were elegantly structured to disproportionately and systematically advantage one group over the other. These were policies. The Homestead Act, which gave thousands of acres of land to over 1.6 million white families and was not equally applied to Black people. The effects was that you had white families who built wealth, and while Black families could not. Redlining, which is a mid-20th century discriminatory practice, which was actually built and given birth in my hometown of Baltimore City, but that gave home loans to certain individuals and made them unavailable to other individuals. A GI Bill, which had sweeping impacts and benefits for veterans, which really helped to build an entire middle class, including college tuition, low-cost home loans, unemployment insurance, but was also constructed in a way that really only certain groups could benefit from it, and constructed in a way that you saw how many Black veterans had difficulty in accessing. Legally segregated schools up until 1954's Brown versus Board of Education. And then also, then following that up with school funding policies that really determined people's neighborhoods and their property taxes would then go towards how we were going to fund and build out the school apparatus. That's just one example of how we watched policies that were put in place that then created massive levels of economic divides and it made it incredibly difficult for people to be able to rebound from that. And we've seen how those collections of policies have then had catastrophic consequences, particularly in areas like now, particularly in times like now, where we've seen how the economic impact of COVID-19 has been so difficult, particularly for those families who have already been feeling the brunt of unequal economic policies. I think about the work that we have over at Robinhood, where last year we funded a study through the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law to look at the economic impact of the criminal justice system. The findings were absolutely staggering, but not at all surprising. That $372 billion of earnings were lost in the United States every year for those who have a criminal conviction or having spent time in prison. For those people who had any connection whatsoever, whether it's conviction or not, but just any type of involvement or touch point with the criminal justice system, on average, had an average of a little over $500,000 of income lost over their lifetime, just by simple touch point in the criminal justice system and with law enforcement. These are policies. And these are the impacts that we've seen, how policies then have a distinct and have an important fabric build when it comes to our society and our citizens. And so this is why it's important to engage with policymakers in order to influence how government leaders tackle issues of economic injustice and sustainable economic mobility. And so tonight, I'm absolutely honored to have two policymakers who have grappled with these issues from their unique seat in government. And the first I want to introduce is my friend, Michael Tubbs, who recently served as the mayor of the city of Stockton, California. And upon taking office in 2017, at the age of 26 years old, Mayor Tubbs became both the nation's youngest mayor of a city over 100,000 people and Stockton's first African-American mayor. He has continued to lead the charge on amazing innovations and also seeing how public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector all work together to create a better life for people within his jurisdiction. And so, Mr. Mayor, Michael, it's an honor to have you here, and thank you so much for joining us, man.
I was just taking notes. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the great framing.
Well, listen, I think that the frame is important because I think oftentimes, when people talk about, why do we have the measures of inequality that we have, that people will point towards things like, well, if we can just do a philanthropic thing here or just have a business do this there, that it can make a market difference. And the truth is, it can make a market difference, but it still has to correlate with how this is addressing and dealing with policies that are still very much put in place. And I mean, I think about for you, I mean, you entered office in 2017. And like many cities, and there's literally an amazing HBO documentary about both your life and your journey in Stockton. But when you look at what Stockton was dealing with when you first came on board, you were talking about a city that was absolutely grappling with these issues of economic inequalities and economic injustice. As you saw that, and when you decided to make the run to go to address this in elected office, and you could have gone any different directions in terms of your career, why did you think that government was the place that you wanted to focus on? And how did you approach that when you first walked into the seat to think about how you wanted to support the people of Stockton?
Yeah, no, it ties back a lot into what you discussed in your framing. But I think first is growing up in poverty and just really living with those impacts viscerally. Um, I really first bought into this idea that poverty was because of individual choices, that my mom made the choice to have me young. My father made choices that ended up in him being incarcerated. And that's why our family struggled financially. And then when I got to college, I realized that no, there were policies, that there were system failures, that there were policy choices that created the conditions and the environments that led to individuals making choices that can either protract poverty, prolong poverty, or make it harder to escape from poverty. But that so much you can't legislate individual choices, but you can legislate the environments in which individuals live. And that's why I became obsessed with government, because I view government not as the savior or the panacea for everything, but that it's the only thing that touches everything at scale. And as you laid out so eloquently in the intro, at the very least, government has to repair that which it has caused. If there's a direct line, a direct reason why B is happening and it's because of A government action, then government action has to be used to rectify. And that's what led me to go back and run for office. And it's interesting because my first year in office as mayor, first I was on city council, and I realized as a part-time city council member, the crux of all the issues we were solving for in Stockton was poverty. And we talked about housing issues. We talked about violence issues. We talked about mental health issues. We talked about educational attainment issues. And I realized because we were doing all these different interventions that so much of it was because the root cause was structural violence and poverty in the city, where almost a quarter of folks were living in poverty, 33% of our children, another third on both were a paycheck away from being in poverty. So long story short, we ran for mayor, and I realized as a city, the most important thing we can do is figure out how to fight poverty. And also being very clear-eyed that the city in and of itself isn't necessarily the best anti-fighting tool in terms of government. Like federal government and county governments and state governments, I would argue, have a much more direct role, but cities can do something. So I said, from a land use perspective, how do we begin to reverse the impacts of redlining in Stockton so that we're creating environments where investments can come through, so that housing can be built that's affordable, et cetera. Then I also said, what can we do to pilot and test ideas that maybe city governments can't do, but state or national governments can? And that's where the guaranteed income pilot came from. It literally came from knowing that we couldn't do everything, but knowing poverty was an issue. And the last thing I'll say on this question is that my first year as mayor, during the summer for our book club, we used the Other Westmore as our book club by book club selection. I don't think I've ever told you that.
No.
And in the course of doing that, we had a discussion about sort of structure versus agency. And we talked about how, yes, there were different choices that you and the Other Westmore made, and that's incredible. But the focus is look at the environments they both grew up in.
That's right.
And how even it was both structurally bad for both of them, but even for the Westmore we were talking about, the one who's went to West Point, how it was slightly better. Like there was a couple things that were slightly better that led to his choices going a little bit further. And I think your story is so perfect because so many people love to stress exceptionalism. I think it's incredibly important and inspiring that you're saying, yes, I'm an exceptional person. I worked really hard. I made the right choices. And with all that, we still have to talk about structure. You're not going to use me to make it seem like these structures don't exist. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
No, listen, bless you and thank you. I think about your journey, because one of the things I'm so inspired by you on it's this idea of saying, we see the story of Michael Tubbs. We see where he came from, and we see that led him to not just Sanford, but it led him to City Hall. But it also does come back to this idea of we can't talk about that without understanding that there was almost this prerequisite of luck that plays into this. And there's something so fundamentally unfair and inhumane when we are relying on luck in order for individuals to be able to navigate a path that we as a society are just making inherently far too difficult for people. And I think about your leadership, because you are right. One of the beauty of how you kind of approached it was this idea of how can government leverage all these other facets and areas to be able to create the pathways, to be able to de-risk, whether it was SEED, the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, and we talk about basic income pilot, or whether you're talking about the Stockton Scholars, right, where you secured $20 million of private donations to provide $4,000 to help students pay for college or trade school, for a decade. that's really innovative stuff when we're talking about municipal leadership, where municipal leadership is saying, we have to be aggressive, yet we have to be humble in the way that we think about the things that we're trying to get done and how do we leverage these other pieces to be able to get done what it is we're trying to get done here. How did you think about that idea and the idea of piloting work and working with others to then essentially de-risk innovations that you then could take over to a larger scale?
Yeah, first I had a really great team, but secondly, I really realized that as a government official, as a mayor in Stockton, you have max of 8 years, and candidly, I thought I would have 8 years. So I'm glad I moved as fast as I did because because people were telling me to slow down the whole time. But I was like, I only have 8 years. It ended up with four. Right. And so that was part of it. But part of it was just thinking sort of root cause and thinking about sort of, again, just being explicitly like I hate poverty. I find it to be antiquated and abhorrent and actually a sign of an uncivilized society. I think it's disgusting that we allow it to happen. So all my energy was focused on, from this seat, what can I do to fight poverty? So part of it was directly with looking at guaranteed income, but part of it was also looking at sort of the auxiliary impacts of poverty, and one of them being educational attainment. Stockton, of the top 100 cities, is number 99 in this country
Mm.
for adults with a 4-year degree or higher. And that doesn't mean people in Stockton are dumber than the rest of the country, but it does mean there's some barriers to accessing higher education, which feeds into cycles of poverty because folks aren't able to sort of access the jobs. Because there's also not even a skilled economy for folks who don't go to college. It's just high school diploma, work at a warehouse, right? So I said, no, we're gonna do something to elevate that. And I realized as local government, we government's so slow and so scary, or so afraid, I think is the proper term. So we're so afraid that I realized that philanthropic capital could, to your point, could de-risk. And if I could move in first with philanthropy to show what's possible, then I can move for government to scale. So one of the things I was hoping to do with the Stockton Scholars Program was to spend my first term with the philanthropic dollars to get it for a decade, but then to talk about using some revenue, some cannabis tax revenue, to have it endowed in perpetuity after we saw success in the first 3 years. Because I get, particularly in communities like Stockton, government dollars are so scarce, and you want to be very careful and thoughtful with taxpayer dollars. Although I would argue we should exercise that same amount of caution and thoughtfulness and intention on kind of defense spending and tax cuts and these other ways we just spend taxpayer money without really half of the conversation around sort of being a budget austerity, et cetera. Anyway, but the plan was to start with philanthropic capital, to proof of concept and prove that, and then using that to make the political case. Because what I found is that in theory, it's easy to disagree, just based off a feeling or an assumption or even bias. But when it's out in the world, you have to react to it. And the conversation becomes at least a little bit more factual in terms, and then we have a conversation like, do we not want these kids to go to college? Because we show it works, we show kids are responding. Put your money where your mouth is. I think for me, one of my strengths and also probably one of my weaknesses, as mayor and as leader, is just being very direct to call the question and say, well, look, this is the issue, this is a solution. If we really care about this issue, this is what we'll do. If we don't care about this issue, we're not going to do it. Then you can't cry to me about this being an issue because we had to pass to a solution and you rejected it. So that's what I was using philanthropy for, to kind of quiet all the excuses and to like, no, look, someone else is going to pay for it so we can see if it works. But once we prove it works, we have a moral responsibility to do something because we know the status quo isn't working.
And and I think about the idea of quieting the naysayers, and because oftentimes I think so many of these debates and conversations, they can become incredibly polarizing, they can become incredibly partisan, and somehow we have figured out a way of saying things like, we don't believe that children should grow up in poverty. Somehow has become a partisan statement. We believe that there should be a universal right to housing or healthcare or food or schooling, that somehow becomes a partisan state, that those become partisan statements. But the beauty of being a mayor, the beautiful thing about being an executive is you really don't have the patience nor runway to be able to do that, because you have to solve people's problems every single day. So how did you convince? How do you go through the process of helping to underscore and highlight the fact that what you're pushing for is just data driven and smart sense, and not get caught up in the back and forth of the partisan divide that oftentimes has this gear stopping way of being able to get people what they need and frankly what they deserve.
Yeah, I think part of it was doing our best to speak in terms of values, in terms of this is not left, right, this is forward, this is about progress, and this is a community issue that you've identified as an issue. We don't know what the answer is. Here is my best thinking about an answer. Let's try it and test it. But I would also just be very frank and say, even in doing that, some of the partisan stuff still happens because of the polarized world we live in. So
Mm.
I think and probably to my political detriment, I just became very focused after about 2 months in the office and realizing just the terrain I was in about just building a coalition of the willing. And if I can get enough people to at least get on the ground, that's enough. And I'll work on it. I'll work on convincing as much as I can. But I could have spent 4 years trying to make everyone who was upset about being explicit about anti-poverty, or convincing everyone who was upset that I wasn't interested in blaming individuals for structural problems. And could have probably got more political support that way, but wouldn't have been able to get as much done and as quickly, or to move as far and move the ball as far as we did. So I think part of it is building a coalition of the willing and understanding that, particularly on the issue that's been an issue in this country for hundreds of years, that's going to take time for a lot of people to catch up, and that
Mm.
you have to build and reach, build and reach, build and reach. But I do not advocate stopping and stalling so that everyone feels good, because again, I think for me, like Dr. King said, there's just a real fierce urgency of now. And I think when you're in a position to lead, particularly a position of government, which really impacts everyone, but it's folks who are in poverty who actually depend on government the most, and not because they're dependent because they don't have agency, but they're depend on government because they can't opt out to private services.
Yeah.
So the government has to work efficiently because they don't get to hire private security or gated communities for their houses. They don't get to pay for private schools. The public commons that they pay into is all they can afford to pay into. They don't have the money to pay taxes and or evade paying taxes and then pay for our own suite of private services. And I think it's that orientation and energy that I brought to my job, and realizing that part of the work of a leader, and I think that's the difference. And I mean, Blake is a great example of this, between a politician and a leader, right? Because I think politicians generally reflect the zeitgeist of today. They reflect where the community is. And I think a leader is someone who reflects where we need to be. And
Mm.
oftentimes that takes a degree of unpopularity, that just takes a degree of friction and pushing. And I think for issues like poverty, that takes a degree of okay with people not getting it yet, right? And I think that part of the issues and what feeds into that dysfunction we talked about earlier in terms of partisanship is that everyone's just being a politician and trying to reflect the temperature of the room. And we need folks who are just going to change the temperature to where it needs to be.
To your point, the difference between being a thermostat and a thermometer.
Yeah, I was going to say that, but I didn't know which was which. I don't want to sound dumb. I went a long way to explain it, but that's what I was trying to say. But I get confused which is which.
Nah, listen, you are definitely a thermostat. You are definitely a thermostat. You don't just tell us what the temperature is. You make it so. You make it so. In fact, you brought him up, so I want to bring him into this conversation. Michael Blake, I think he's joined on here. There he is. Our good brother Michael Blake, who is so our next speaker. And by the way, just so y'all know, I'm probably the only Science Institute fellow that has two movie stars as guests. Two movie stars as guests for my seminar, because both of these two good brothers right here have been featured. The whole world knew who they were because they've both been featured in documentaries, both about their work and their fight in this space. And but our next guest is born in the Bronx to Jamaican immigrants and is absolutely dedicated his life towards this fight towards economic justice and truthfully pulling every single lever possible to be able to create economic justice. He's served formerly as a New York State Assemblyman in the 79th District, uptown in the Bronx, where you're not going to find somebody who is more passionate about their constituency and their population than good brother Mike Blake. He actually began his career in journalism, got the political bug when he started working in the Yes We Can training program, and has never looked back since. And he also served as the vice chair of the Democratic Party, the White House Associate Director for Public Engagement, Deputy Associate Director for the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. He's been a champion and a hero and a friend to both myself and also to Mayor Tubbs. So Michael, blessings. Thank you for joining us, man. Thank you so much.
See, I appreciate you, Wes, and that's why we are good fraternity brothers, as opposed to Mayor Tubbs, who was clowning me on Twitter for the last hour leading up to this. Now, let's just set the record straight. It is accurate that I did ask Mayor Tubbs to do several projects while we were at the White House together. Is that accurate? This is the opportunity while we're all here together. Mayor Tubbs, please, go ahead.
It's accurate, and I would only add that I just wasn't I was just not assigned to you. I was assigned to another team that had me doing projects as well. But I enjoyed myself and learned so much from your.
Hey, Blake. He said. I think Blake thought I was his intern. I said he thinks we're all his interns.
You know what I mean? I just, you got to find a way to create legacy out here somehow, some way. Man. I'm just saying. And in the midst of that, I became an assembly member, but he became a mayor. So so clearly something worked out for Tubbs along the way. I'm just saying. So just saying.
Being outside in the cold in the White House with those people whose waves were done wrong and kind of hearing their stories and empathizing with them, that gave me the ear to run. So thank you.
And it prepared you to implement universal basic income in your city. So it was just the stepping stone to get us there in the way we needed to. So yes, my brother. Right. That's good to see everybody.
It's good to see you. Good to see you. Well, so let me actually ask the first question based exactly along those lines, right? So when we first started off, we were talking about just a context setting for people as to why policy matters. And it's not just that policy is there to erase the wrongs, but we have to be cognizant and we have to understand that policy's complicity and intentionality in the fact that many of those wrongs were created from policy, right? And so it's impossible to talk about how do you address ills without understanding the role that policy actually took in many cases of creating them. And so you have been wholly focused your entire career on adding this idea of an equity-based policy lens to policymaking. How do you think about that? How do you incorporate that lens into your policy designs and the programs that you have initiated and are still continue to look to initiate?
So I'll start from where you were at with Mayor Tubbs and Wes. I just got to say before we keep going, you are a brother's brother. So let's just start there. For what you have been doing for the people, and incredibly grateful that you asked us to join you today, not just in the education, but in the work on the ground. You mentioned earlier around thermometer versus thermostat, and in that same manner, there's a difference between equity and equality. And I can't recall when I read it. It might have been 2 or 3 years ago, but I read a piece that has stayed with my spirit since. And simply put, it said there is a difference between racism and prejudice. And the core point was everyone has some element of prejudice, but it is impossible for everyone to be racist because that would mean that you are institutionalizing systems against another race. Why is that relevant to your question? Fundamentally, and it may make people uncomfortable, but it is the reality. Most policies in this country's origin to date are rooted in isms. Whether it's racism, whether it's sexism, whether it's classism. And so at the end of the day, if I want to be focused on how do I break that, I have to be intertwined in breaking the ism. I have to be thoughtful in what Brother Senator Warnock said throughout his campaign. He said that we are battling two pandemics of COVID-19 and COVID-16-19. So tying this to the data, Black people died at a rate 3.6 times higher than white people during COVID. It wasn't just because of just underlying conditions in the immediate, it was the underlying societal conditions. It was the challenges in getting access to a tablet, because I can't have you do remote learning if you don't have a tablet. I can't say to you to have socially distant quarters when you're living in public housing with lead and no hot water. And so the way I approached a lot of this was a mindset of every year, if there is one thing I could achieve, how could that one thing provide equity and break an ism? So whether it be the My Brother's Keeper program, whether it be the funding we did for our entrepreneurs, whether it be going against public housing discrimination, whether it was holding up the budget along with Speaker Hasty and Joe Lentoff, Assemblyman Lentoff, for Raise the Age. Because to me, Wes, at the end of the day, and you mentioned this earlier, there is a difference between legislator and executive. Mayor Tubbs is able to say, here's the vision, here's what we're going to do, let's move forward. As a legislator, you have to get people to believe in a vision and say, we're going to incorporate this. And so tactically speaking, tying this all together, when was my critical moment of impact? It was during the budget, because I knew that if there was any time I knew to impact change at scale, where people who may not see and be comfortable with the isms, it was during the budget process. And so tying this all together, that is how I approached a lot of this. It's the way I think about still now, and Vice President Biden at the time, now President Biden, was pretty adamant with us when we were in the White House. He would always say, a budget shows your values. And that is how I approached my policy making. That's the way I approach my strategy. And that's how I approach equity. Because at the end of the day, if everyone cared about equity, we wouldn't be having these conversations. So until we're in a space where everyone buys in and focuses on it not being, and you appreciate this from a Robin Hood perspective, that it's not charity, but an investment, right? That if you really want to break the cycles, there's an institutional approach that has to happen. And until that point, then that's the way I'm going to approach it from my legislative and my strategic lens.
But and I think one thing that you've repeatedly done, because you're absolutely right. I mean, the idea of where we put our capital says everything that we need to know about what we prioritize, about what we think is important. And you've been very clear. Not only have you been a champion when it comes to fighting to end and eradicate this scourge of poverty, but also been very deliberate about how that needs to then happen, right? What are the key ingredients and components? So whether it was the millions of dollars that over $2 million that you secured for the housing authority for improvements and developments in your district, whether it was focusing on supporting entrepreneurs, where you had you were able to secure $500,000 just support Bronx entrepreneurs through the American Entrepreneurship Award. So you've been very clear in putting your flag in the ground as to these are the components that we have to be able to do, the things we have to be able to get done to address this issue of economic mobility and economic prosperity for all people. How did you go through the process of identifying which elements of the whole wide variety become the most important that we have to drill in and focus on if we're going to be serious about creating measurements of economic stability, economic security, and economic empowerment for all people?
I focused on the assets, and the reality is, and for most of you, this is your first time interacting with me, I'm a very straight shooter. You can't ignore, when we talk about equity, it is intertwined with race and it's intertwined to the assets. It's intertwined with a mindset of, again, centuries of how we have been built was ensuring that Black and now Black and brown people could not have access to the assets, because that's how they grew their equity, right? It still doesn't make any sense that education in public settings is determined by property taxes. That's foolish. Doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. You are intentionally creating a system where kids that are in poor areas cannot have a good education, right? And so when I started thinking about what to do, at that time, Secretary Tom Perez, then Chairman Perez, he would often tell me, do things at scale. And that really stayed with me. Really stayed with me. He said, like everyone can talk about, let me change one policy here, let me do another policy here. But when I start talking about, we are going to fight for funding to eliminate and reduce lead at scale in public housing. We are going to get $500,000 so that these entrepreneurs can grow at scale. I'm going to focus on home ownership and not just renters at scale. I was constantly thinking about the asset. And I was thinking about the ownership of it. And that is what really drove my approach and my strategy. And within that is the recognition that too often people were creating strategies for us from a place of, well, you're enduring poverty and you're struggling, so let me give you what I think you should get, as opposed to, we're going to get what we deserve at a minimum. Right? And so when you come at that mindset, then you start saying that I'm going to be very simple in my ask, that I know there are 300 things that I can ask for that would change the conditions. But if I'm intentional and thoughtful of, I'm going after this big thing this year, I'm going after this big item this year, I'm changing it at scale. And again, I'm focusing on the asset. Lastly to that is realizing the magnitude of the moment. President Obama, when we were there with him those first 2.5 years, there were many people who did not want us to go after healthcare. And he repeatedly said, this is when we're going to go after this. In that same manner, from raise the age and other elements, it creates that same dynamic that we have to be thoughtful of as well.
So let me ask your opinion on question of scale when it comes to something that I know you're very passionate about, and that's this idea of mentorship and support. And I say that because I think so. For example, you were able to secure $20 million to pilot my brother's keeper programs in New York State, making it the first in the nation, a very real amount of money for something that becomes incredibly important for all of us. And then the question becomes, but how do we scale human support? How do we scale to so that the things that you and I got inherently, right, from family, from coaches, teachers, whatever the case might be, but people who woke up every morning with the hope of what we could be, and that we then walked into that light. How do we focus on this idea of scaling that so that every single one of our children can, from somebody, from some space, be able to feel that love and to be able to feel that attention that was able to help us navigate and go through this process of going from where we were to where we are now?
So you all are watching in real time. You're probably wondering why did I stand up? It's because I wanted my mom to listen.
Yeah.
She was leaning in.
Hello.
That's Hillary.
Hey, Mom, how you doing?
Hello, how are you?
Blessings. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Likewise.
And I actually think it's the ordained timing of what you just asked me. So I think a lot of times people forget where they came from. And they create policies and they talk about things, forgetting who they are, and forgetting that that one or two different things happen along the way, and you're not in that space. And so we were actually talking about this earlier. Like I tell people often, I'm still a kid from Crescent and Burnside. Yes. That's how I operate, right? And Mama talks about the days when, slept on church pews and overcame that to raise 4 boys, one of which was an Army veteran who served this country like you served in this country, Wes, right? And I start there because you think about scale when you don't forget values. So when you start thinking like, okay, homelessness is a humanity issue. To address homelessness, there are so many things that have to be addressed. Hunger as well. We talked about that a few days ago, actually, right? Like, that's not just going to be like, oh, I'm just going to do that on one day and then we're good. That's impossible, right? I can't say to these young cats, yo, you know what? Why do you keep getting in and out of jail? Unless I'm real focused on, do they have jobs in the first place? Did they have good schools in the first place? And am I willing to acknowledge where I came from? You know, data on this, because I always think it's important when we have these kinds of conversations to educate the masses, right? The Bronx is the most diverse county in America, according to the census. There is an 89.7% likelihood that any two people you meet in the Bronx be a different ethnicity. We have the largest West African population outside of West Africa in the world. But yet you have the poorest congressional district. Now, if you hear that and you're like, well, that's so terrible. Yes, that's terrible. But you have to also understand the underlying occurrence of the value. Why are we still in this dynamic? Because we're so welcoming of our immigrant communities that have been coming in, but we have not created strategies at scale to elevate our immigrant communities, right? And so in that manner, when we start thinking about it of, yo, who are we as a people, and strategies like that, when we do it that way, that's when we can really address things at the level that we need to.
And you know, it's saying we talk about, and you just take that one example, and we talk about our immigrant populations and our immigrant communities who are literally the foundations and the backbones on which this nation continues to grow and push and thrive. And how it's both that we have policies that are not incorporating that into it, but actually policies that are intentionally leaving them out.
Absolutely, no question. And Wes, this is why I go back to the beginning point about the isms, intentionally leaving people out. These things don't happen. You talk about redlining in Baltimore. These things just don't randomly happen. And until we are willing to have that real conversation, until we're willing to engage in the framework that police departments were created as slave patrols, until we're willing to engage and realize that for decades, Democrat and Republicans intentionally did not give money when it came to public housing. Until we're willing to do that and have that same level of intensity with our intentionality, until we're willing to say that is how we're going to approach it, that's when you start breaking the cycles. I say often, it's time to go from pain to promise, over and over again. Say that, when we think about it in that manner, your block won't block your blessing. Your zip code won't deny your destiny. That's why I tell these cats over and over again. But your word right there is the key in all of this. When we talk about policy and politics, which are different things, everybody, right? There is an intentionality that has to be there. I have to win the race to change the policy. And if I don't win the race in terms of being the actual principal, I need to be engaged in the continual politics to change the policy. I just had a call with someone earlier today who said they wanted to talk with us around criminal justice reforms that have to keep going. And what do we do in that manner? Be intentional.
That's right. Well, and speaking of being intentional, I am going to, I already see we have a bunch of questions that are coming in both in the Q&A and then also questions that are coming in over the stream and Facebook Live. So one of the beauties of the Sign Institute is that we get fellows who come and support us. And Jennifer Thurston is one remarkable one, actually an Army vet herself. And so she has been fielding the questions and is going to lead the Q&A that the audience will then have with you, if that's all right, Mr. Vice Chair. So Jennifer, absolutely. Thank you for all of your wonderful work, and I turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you both. I'm honored to be here. Thank you, Mr. Blake. I appreciate all that you do. And so without further ado, getting to some of our questions, Lisa Manning asks, how do we shift politicians into leaders? Is it possible, or do we need an entirely new set of people in the office and potentially even a whole new system?
Well, I think it's a both and. So I think, most politicians are leaders. The problem is the minority, the super minority that does dumb things, make everyone else look bad. And I always encourage people, change it to your industry. Any industry that you're a part of, I guarantee you got some crazy folk who act a fool. And I would not say to you automatically, you're corrupt, right? But for some reason that has been established here. Why is that the case? That goes to the second part of your question, Jennifer. Because there is an expectation of hope and trust for those of us in politics, right? Same way, I think if someone's a faith leader, some way if someone's a public, a part of a public entity in that manner. Do we need a new system? I don't think we need a new system. We need to reform the system. Absolutely. I do believe that. There have to be tremendous changes. There's a lot of groups that are out there. And full disclosure, I engage with many of them. New Leaders Council, which is training millennials across the country. National Democratic Training Committee, which has been remarkable. The Collective PAC, 4.us. There's a lot of groups that are out here doing their thing that are training next generation. And I think at the end of the day, combining it from policy and politics, if we had the same level of passion around education, and quite frankly, on the flip side, the same level of commitment that we do for a great sports team, that we would for politics, our policies would be better, right? Like, you're not thinking, I'm a Yankees fanatic. Obviously, I'm from the Bronx, right? Like, the Yankees didn't just become the Yankees. Wes, when the Ravens won the Super Bowl, that didn't just randomly happen. There were a lot of work that happened along the way around development. And we have to be willing to develop our leaders to show them the skills to get them there. When we do that, it will be clear that many leaders are politicians and vice versa. And it is my hope that someone watching today will decide you're going to run for office, you're going to be a chief of staff, you're going to be a staffer in some way to keep going.
I think you're on mute, Jennifer.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate you bringing up education in that, because another part of the question that someone else had is, how do we convince other individuals that don't have children at home or never had children that investing in the youth of today, whether it's in school choice or primary school or through our collegiate advanced degrees, that investing in our young people or people today is an advantage for everyone and not just for that individual.
It's essential for our survival, right? Like, I just needs to all internalize. I was saying this about 2-3 weeks ago. You can make the empirical argument that there was not a place in America hurt more than the Bronx during the COVID crisis, right? And I ran for Congress. I made an intentional decision to suspend a lot of work in my campaign because my people were struggling to eat. They were struggling to keep their jobs, and this is going to make sense to your question, Jennifer. So in that manner, a lot of these cats didn't know Wuhan, China. I didn't know about Wuhan, China. I've been to China myself, right? But quickly you learn that things change. Why is that tied here? A generation of kids are going to be behind permanently because of what just happened over the last 11 months. And if that by itself is not enough motivation for us to say the investment in a kid in a year can lead to what happens in their life, then I don't know what else we need to see, right? When you think about why there's been so much heartache that has happened in so many of our communities, it's because of the lack of investment, which leads to so many people that are in communities such as our own, where overwhelmingly, why was unemployment skyrocketing to 25%? Because we have an industry that is tied on a retail industry that was tied on foot traffic, where you can't have foot traffic in the middle of a health pandemic. And because of the lack of investment years ago, we were in this space now. So to everybody watching and listening, if you want to have a better world next year, the next decade, the next 20 years, That doesn't just happen unless you invest in your fellow neighbor and stranger. That teacher that you didn't know, someone believed in them. That doctor that might have saved a loved one in your life, which just happened within our family just a few days ago, the blessing that happened within our family. I didn't know that person. We don't know that person, but someone invested in that kid years ago. And I want you to love me even if you don't know my name. I want you to know that we're on the same journey if we come from a different destination. I want you to understand that we are interwoven around collective success, even if we will never cross paths one another.
Thank you for that, sir. I appreciate that. Looks like we have about 7 minutes left. Okay, so this was a question for both you and Mayor Tubbs. I'll just read it. It's a little long. You
That's
described.
fine. I'll answer for Tubbs. I got many comments I can say about him anyway. So it's all good.
Perfect. Okay. You described how important it was to enter the political space to right policy wrongs. However, among the many policies and barriers that have disenfranchised people is the cost associated with running for office. How did you overcome the personal wealth gap in running for office while most participants are extremely wealthy?
You determine your end goals and then work backwards. And so, you know, we realized that on the onset, you first, in the vision of what David Seamus said to us often, find your why. So I asked myself, why do I want to run? Then why do I want to run for this? Once I'm comfortable with those answers, then you make your plan. And in the same way, you make your plan to say how I'm going to graduate. You look at years down the line, work backwards. In the same way as Wes is thinking about Robin Hood, you think about the plan down the line, work backwards. That's how you got to treat a campaign. And a lot of times we don't realize a campaign is just a startup. It's a startup business. That's the really best way to think about it. There's a set timetable around with it. A date's going to come on election day and then it's done. Now this new era where there's early voting and absentee voting that's increased, where it may take a few extra days. But once I have a clear sense of the metrics of it all, it usually takes contacting someone so that they see your name 7 times before they remember. It usually takes an intersectional communication pattern of paid and digital. Once you start figuring out that, once you also, I'll give you another tidbit. Once you realize that usually you have to see the universe of people who voted in the last 3 similar types of election, not 3 consecutive elections. So if I'm running for state assembly, let me look at the 3 previous state assembly races. Once I figured out that kind of universe, I'm then able to figure out what my budget is. And then from there, I got to be disciplined enough to map that out on a day-by-day basis of how am I going to make the phone calls and host the events and put together an infrastructure to get there. And in that same manner, you know, again, this goes back to, do you want this, right? Do you want this enough? Are you going to put in the work to say, you know what, I am going to graduate. I don't care how we get there, you know, loans, no loans, sleepless nights, what have you. I'm going to find a way to get there. And so I was not going to allow previous condition hold me back. And then lastly on this, you know, the amount of things I had to go through to win this race, right? So like, you know, I'm a kid that was born with a heart murmur. I'm a kid that fell asleep at the wheel in 2001. I'm a young man that was recruited to run for office. And then the people that recruited me turned their back and then sued me 3 times to try to kick me off the ballot. This is nothing but God, right? So the notion of I was real clear on my why. So that then as we're putting together the infrastructure, I was clear, okay, we need to get to that dollar figure for us to be competitive. Now let's put together the mechanics. The last thing to your point, Jennifer, yes, you may not come from a rich background and a lot of people may be rich. I get that. But a lot of times people have one path to victory as opposed to multiple paths to victory. You know, when Kerry ran, when Gore ran, they pretty much had one path. A lot of people forget this. People kept talking about Bush versus Gore in Florida. If Gore would have won New Hampshire and or Tennessee, we're not even having this conversation. We were very intentional of having multiple paths. And so within that, despite the upbringing, we had multiple paths on how we're going to win our race. And I would say to everybody, do not allow how you grew up or where you came from to determine where you're going.
No, you're so right about that. And very well said. And Simon actually also wanted to ask, along with the economic injustice that you were facing at the time that you were seeking election, there was also a lack of name recognition. So how do people without that name recognition and minorities get to where you are now? What's that path? And I know that there's multiple tributaries to get there as well, and not one direct way.
That's right. So let me be real Bronx right now, as
All
Wes
right.
can be real Baltimore right now, right? You got treated like you're trying to holler at somebody, right? And like in that zone, you don't just say, I'm just gonna make one call and then I'm good. You are persistent about it. I'm gonna make my calls, I'm gonna check up, I'm gonna make my mistakes, I'm gonna figure it out, I'm gonna keep, right? When it comes to name recognition, that's the same rhythm. Because I have to presume there's a lot of people also telling you why they're great for you. So it's not just about a consistency. Stay with me, y'all, because there's 3 C's on this. It's not just about consistency. It's about choice and contrast. So I'm consistently driving home Michael Blake, but I'm giving you choice and contrast. I'm communicating to you that there is a difference from me to these other people. They're great people, but there is a unique difference of the things I want to do, and you have a choice. Very simple exercise. I know we're short on time. Very simple exercise. When you think about this, when Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump ran against each other, most times people could not remember what Secretary Clinton's theme was. They could remember that Donald Trump kept saying, make America great again, and that he was going to build a wall. Most people can't tell you what was John McCain or Mitt Romney's message, but they can tell you that Obama talked about hope and change, about healthcare and ending a war. Consistent choice and contrast. So when you think about your communication exercise, yes, you got to make sure you have the resource around it, put a program around it. And now it's very different because of digital organizing. Maybe you're on Twitch because of the DJs. Maybe I'm on an IG Live. Maybe it's Facebook. But all of those pieces allow you to have a dedicated approach and a strategy to communicate your message.
Thank you so much for your time, sir. I really appreciate you being here and being willing to answer Wes's questions and our panelists' questions. And hopefully we get to meet in the future. I'm going to turn it back over to you, sir. You got the floor.
Jennifer, blessings and thank you. And again, great work. Thank you so much. And Mr. Vice Chair, my friend, my brother Mike. I mean, I as you know, I mean, I could listen to you all day long. But the other thing that just gives me so much lift is not just what you said, but frankly, it's the beautiful woman to your right, who I know is I got to tell you, man, I've heard him talk about you on so many times and so many occasions. And I can see right now, first, I want to tell you, Mama, you did good. You did so good. And the world is better. The world is better because of your son.
But it takes a team.
Amen. Amen.
Takes a team. Like his older brother, like his godparents, he was best to have the best godfather that when I couldn't step up at work, he stepped up. Then everything we do, it takes a team. Even in politics. When Michael ran the first time, he had a team, a real team that stood by him. Yes. And it takes everyone, knock on doors. I was out all time of night, knocking on doors. Yeah. And whatever you do, and always remember when you have a team and you do it, to say thank you.
Amen. Amen.
You don't, maybe you can't even buy them a gift after, but just say thank you. That goes a long way.
That's right.
And I think tying that together, and again, Wes, you can appreciate especially this point. When you're in a journey like my mom has been on, a journey that we've been on, and a journey that you've been on as a veteran, this might be the first time in this society's generational moment where they took life for granted.
Yep.
Right. And when you're finally in that moment, right, or this is that Vietnam moment, this is that World War I, World War II moment, this is that Great Depression moment, when you're truly in that moment now of, can I breathe? Do I have food to eat? Do I have a house of mine? Am I going to make it to tomorrow? That is the moment we are in right now, the magnitude of the moment. And when we think about why this all matters, from a policy, from a politics standpoint, this is about life. And that's why, yeah, and everything. And so I'll rock with you to the wheels fall off, because you appreciate that. Yeah, every breath that God has given us the chance to give others a chance as well.
Yeah. That's our why. That's our why. That's right. And when you lead, and never forget your why, as to say, if you never forget who you're fighting for, you never stop fighting.
Amen. Find your why. Find your why and keep your why.
Well, I cannot tell you, I cannot thank you enough. I cannot thank both of you enough for blessing us tonight, for gracing us tonight. When we first pulled together the entire syllabus around the idea of how do we talk about economic justice? How do we talk about economic mobility? And, immediately saying you can't have this conversation if you're not also talking about the role that government played, the role that governmental public servants play in that conversation about what's pushed for, what's advocated for, what's not, what needs to be undone, what we need to aggressively move on. Again, I'm just so grateful to both you and Mike Tubbs for saying yes, and not just for saying yes tonight, but just for saying yes to service and serving others in the way that you have. I'm incredibly grateful to all of you for staying with us tonight for, again, another powerful session. We're going to have our next session is going to be on March 2nd. And that'll be again from 5:30 to 6:30. And that one we'll talk about pushing philanthropy out of its comfort zone. And that will be able to take an honest look at the history of philanthropy, its role in creating a more equitable society, and how and why it needs to do more. So to all of you that joined us tonight, for all of you that participated tonight, and for all of you that are now listening to the words of my good brother Blake and good brother Tubbs about finding your why, thinking about the 3 C's, and making sure you're getting involved, just know that the world needs you right now. So bless you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful night, and we'll talk to you soon.